we'll kick off by first of all saying to everyone in the room and everyone online, if you have a question for one of our panelists, if you've been storing it up, will be able to take questions from the online audience, so you can stick those in chat. And if you're part of the online audience, please do that. And would anyone in the room like to get us kicked off with a question that you might be storing up from earlier? Because if not, we'll start off. So I'm here. We heard a lot today about so many trends in open source in terms of what's happening at a global perspective. We heard about its relationship to open research and open science. We heard about it used in industry collaborations. We heard about the aspects in terms of how universities are currently doing open source. And I know, Ian, we've had a lot of discussions about how this fits with overall IP policy and general technology translation and impact for research. So I'm going to start by asking everyone on the panel to consider, when we think about all that and we think about the changes that have happened over the last few decades, how should universities react to that? Because I think there are some things that are embedded in a university system that perhaps can help, and some things that perhaps are inhibiting universities' ability to get the most out of open source and to get the most impact from open source. So I just want to hear from everyone on the panel to say, what do you think should be done to, I suppose, enhance universities' opportunity around open source? So I'll start with you, Pen. Let's go down the line. Yeah, sorry, now that was 5, was it? But
yeah, so I think I like to use this to pitch a concept that I'm working with my colleagues on as part of a research project at the University of Bristol right now. So as part of my postdoctoral research, we are looking at, not only open source, but open research in general. And what are the facilitators and barriers towards adopting these open research practices, right, in universities? Now, it might not come as a surprise to a lot of you, but the way academic institutions are set up right now, it does create certain barriers to doing more open research, including sharing open source technology. So we are actually engaging with university decision makers, for example, with people in research and innovation services, to have these conversations to characterize what these barriers are and how we can improve universities' policies to enable more open research. Now, I say all of this because we call the kind of research that we do meta research, or research on research, right? Because we're doing research on how research is done. And I think it will be very good for universities and research funders to realize that there's a need for doing this kind of research so that we can more formally study what these barriers and opportunities are to create the evidence base to inform policy changes, if that makes sense. So I think this is a gap that's worth filling so that we can make very informed decisions when it comes to enabling more open source practices.
Brilliant.
If that makes sense.
It does. Very meta. We really appreciate that. No, thank you, Pen. And that kind of discussion, I think, is happening globally as the world realizes that, you know, the whole university sector is similar to how the corporate sector have actually been thinking about things like DevOps and just getting better at actually producing the infrastructure for everyone to get more productive. I think in general, universities are probably thinking about similar type of challenges, but also those policies and processes, as you say, that can sometimes block or enable. So thank you for that. So Tobias, from your perspective, thinking maybe about the industry collaborations, what can universities do more of? What should they perhaps do less of?
I do think one topic which is super important is trying to aligning both a bit more on the same tooling set.
Okay.
What I have seen from my own studies is that if you are in the research and the university, you sometimes work with completely different tools when being in the industry. And I do think that open source allows here to use the same tooling in both, because sometimes there are restrictions on which you can use in the industry. Sometimes there are restrictions which you can use in the university, be it budget reasons, be it license reasons. But I do think that open source allows a good middle ground of having the same tooling or the same common ground allowing as well then for easier collaboration down the road between the two sides of.
Excellent point. And I suppose, I mean, one of the things that open source allows for, as you just pointed out, is just to see what that is. I mean, you know, it's something that can be established ahead of the time before industry collaborations can actually happen, to see how that ecosystem is working and what they're using. It doesn't require a discovery phase, because well, maybe it does still require a discovery phase, but presumably that's something that is in the open, so people can more easily discover what that kind of standard tools are for a given ecosystem.
And it then allows the both ecosystem industry as well as universities to easier collaborate together if they have a common ground, pretty much a common tooling. And I think that's an important thing to have, because if you first need to invest a lot of resources on both sides in having the same tooling, having the same collaboration methods, it makes it way harder to collaborate compared to having like these standards already in place beforehand. And it as well helps both parties improving these standards together.
And in your role as being part of the corporate open source community in Europe, would you see differences in that tooling across various different industry verticals, or do you feel like the corporate world in general seem to, you know, coalesce on one more common set of tooling, or are there actual differences between the industries?
I do think there are differences in the industry, but I don't have a concrete example now at the top of my head.
So it's important to do it in context, basically, in terms of for whom, when you're thinking about who you want to collaborate with, it's important to understand what they're, not necessarily assume their tooling either. You probably just want to actually collaborate with them.
Talk to people, ensuring that you have at least the same understanding and not just assuming that everybody else does it the same way as you do. But when you have this understanding, trying to talk together to find maybe what's the way to collaborate together, or what's the tooling required to collaborate together. And I do think that open source allows there to establish this common ground.
Very good, thank you. So Daniel, from your perspective, thinking about, well, I suppose thinking about it from all the hats you wear, as a researcher in the past, as a company who is working in the ecosystem, as a collaborator in the open source community, how are you thinking that the whole university sector can, like, what should they keep doing? What should they stop doing? What should they start doing?
Yeah, I think so. Part of the discussion probably is at two different levels. So if we think about researchers and faculty members, typically they have enough freedom to do and use and produce whatever they want. It's always aligned with their research and so on. From a tool and processing perspective, we are much better now with tools and that are kind of getting the whole process more homogeneous, and with good practices as GitHub or GitLab. So all of this is publicly available. So it's, I want to free this as open source. Then there are some places by default that you can use. So then I would say that researchers at that level have a certain freedom. I think the missing gap probably is from a more university perspective, administrative or so. At that level, there should be some frameworks on how to proceed, how to grow the people, how to specifically train researchers on, but part of the discussion I was sharing before, right, of being better software producers, engaging better with the community, or have some strategies to do certain community building if you want to. So this is not mandatory. But then just with the purpose of building certain more sustainable software and sustainable research over the years, that's probably some things to have in mind. This does not mean that everything has to follow the same process and have a really awesome community. That's not going to happen. But there are some times where this makes sense. And then how to frame the basement with collaboration with the industry, with other universities, and so that's something that should happen at some point. Are we recording this? Well,
yes, we are. We're on the record.
So just personal experience. One of the from the university I came from, and we started. We tried to bring the university to be a shareholder in the company. We didn't find a way. So I mean, it's true. This was 12 years ago, but because of this experience I had, is how can we do this? At least in Spain, which is my experience specifically. I don't know if this is something that is happening, for instance, here in Galway or Ireland, but then give you the next.
Well, that's a nice segue into the discussion about the involvement of universities from a commercialization perspective. And given the rise of so many commercial open source companies now, given the increase of VC interest in open source, companies that are reliant on open source software. Ian, can you maybe discuss with us some of your thoughts around how universities should respond to that trend and indeed the challenge that Daniel faced?
I get the easy question.
Yeah, and also because we haven't heard yet from you, maybe give some background as well to your own role here, just because and just to give people context as well.
So I work in the innovation office here, which is the technology transfer function for the University of Galway. I'm a case manager in the ICT sector. My background is in hardware and software development. I've been in the role here for about 7-8 years, but before that I was started as a chip designer, software designer, software project manager. I was in a startup. So I've kind of seen life on both sides now. So as I was listening to my co-panelists here, I was, Penn introduced his talk by saying yes and I'm here basically saying yes and. I work at the interface between the university and the external actors who have different perspectives and different needs. So I might make one summative statement, which is with regard to, 3 words popped into my head: cost, consistency, and coherency. So I think each university, and I'll generalize this and look at Penn, probably does excellence in spots. And probably does very good everywhere, but excellence in spots. But if you were to ask the university, 1, you couldn't find anybody to ask, and 2, they wouldn't know how good they are. So part of what I can, and I hate to use the word monetize, but what I can represent to the external communities are that sense of the university as a coherently, consistently good actor with regard to software development, cognizant of its role in the open source community and all that entails, cognizant of how open source opens routes to either monetization if you want, but primarily deep and meaningful collaborations based on Tobias's point. So to me, I am the pathway by which the university delivers impact, not monetization per se. If there's money, great. But primarily around how this university delivers on its mission, delivers on its values. And open source would seem to be such an obvious way to do it. The challenge for us is to understand how to use it correctly.
And thinking about the University of Galway specific context, and I'm curious because Daniel posed that challenge of, if there was a spin out, from the University of Galway based on open source software in some way, does the University of Galway have a mechanism to get involved in organizations like that spun out? So
at our stage of maturity, the university takes a minority shareholding. So there's the difference between a minority shareholding and all that entails and stepping up, which is active participation. So the university is taking the view that companies know best how to determine their future. So the best we do is say, we license in enabling technologies. For an open source case, we find ourselves licensing in the additive bespoke software based on an open source, underlying open source components. How active we want to be, I don't think we've had an opportunity where the university would have, say, ownership over an open source project and is actively engaged in ensuring that open source project through the spin-out company gets to a different place. So it's a bit like Tobias's point. If you swap out SAP in university, SAP are interested in active contributions so that the retained or the core application is heading in the right direction, driven by subsequent companies' interventions or developments. We're not at that stage yet. We have 1 or 2 open source projects that we think need to go in that direction, but we've yet to sort of fully comprehend what that means, because it's more than just passively expecting it's going to happen. There's an active component, and this university hasn't yet got to the point where it actively works with its spin-outs.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And we have a question from the floor.
It's a comment.
A comment from the floor.
I'm going to suggest that in your head and in your discourse within this university and with other universities, that you substitute stewardship for the word ownership. Because stewardship is the proper role of universities in projects that have been spun out. That's where you create a comfortable umbrella. You get halo for having done that, and in some cases, you get additional grad students who applied, you get maybe grants from companies who are interested in the work that you've helped create and want to way, a tidy way to be involved with that also gives them a minority share, right? But this idea of ownership is part of what's in the way. If you think of it as stewardship, I think you'll find it's an easier road.
So I think we should take
So
that.
just before you come back, just because some people may not have heard that online, I'll just repeat some of these comments. So this was a discussion about the terminology we use and how sometimes the words we use matter. And in this case, it was a suggestion that perhaps the university's role should be that of a steward, and that the stewardship of projects may be may produce more fruitful conversations than the term ownership. But back to you.
So I think stewardship is the correct term to be used throughout.
Yeah.
Be it data, regardless. So we've yet to establish any monetization path based on an open source project. So it's unexplored territory. But I think there are challenges around the opens. And I was looking forward to the distinction between open science, open research, open data. But I think stewardship, is more coherent with the university's role and values. So if I inadvertently use the word ownership, yeah, culpa. But I think stewardship is when the university achieve that systemic view or that coherent view as to how it approaches its opens, then I think stewardship is the framing of whatever we do. It will be framed with regard to we are only stewards for this as it passes from and through us.
Very nice. So I think there has been a general consensus that we like the word stewardship. So for all the opens, which I really like too. And I want to build on that theme just from my own perspective. If I was thinking about what I would love to see from the university sector, I think it's more discussions like this. I think there is a lot of conversation to be had about the context of open source within universities, how that differs from both what's happening in the corporate sector, but also in the broader open source community. When we think about the constraints that exist within the university's, system and the broader research system, and how that might impact people's goals or tools or infrastructure or anything, the process that we all face. I do think that having conversations like this, where we talk not just about what's currently happening, but the kind of words and language that can be most impactful, that can be very, very valuable. So thanks again for everyone having this conversation. So I'll open up again to the floor. So does anyone have a question or a suggestion or a comment based on this discussion about what you think universities need to consider, or aspects we need to consider in universities to support and make open source a more valuable part of the opens as well, and in terms of getting impact for the university? We've got a question over here. Eva?
Can I ask if you think the university is the right level to be approaching this at, or do we need to go higher and look at policy or funders or the drivers of change in this area? I mean, I think you can have bottom up and that's fine, but you also, for a lot of universities to implement policy or change, it needs to come from top down. And if so, how best can we influence that, or what are the four?
Great question. So again, to repeat for those online, so the question is whether or not we're thinking about it in terms of where the kind of influence needs to come from. Is there a potential for a policy, higher level policy discussion that could influence universities' actions? And if so, what might that look like, if I paraphrase that correctly? So does anyone want to take that one? Ben, yeah, go first.
Because of some of the meta research that I'm doing right now, one conversation I had was actually with one of my PhD supervisors, who after I graduated and got my PhD, he not only became department head, he also held some decision-making roles in the university. And I had a great conversation with him where we were talking about exactly your question. And he said, when he sat in that position, making university level policy, he realized that even within the institutional constraints that universities operate under, he discovered that there is still a lot that university can initiate on their own. And we had a whole conversation about things to discover that, hey, actually within the university, we just need to decide to do it. No one's actually stopping us. On the other hand, those wider external constraints do exist. Again, using my example about the need to do more formal research on our research culture and how to enable open research. On a higher level, UKRI, which stands for UK Research Innovation, the main public funding body in the UK, just very recently, they pre-announced, and I like to pre-announce, they like announcing the announcement, that they're going to have a new funding call, I think in late April, for meta research projects that's cross disciplines. And this description of the call is specifically to ask for researchers to do research on how can we improve our research policies and institutions to improve our research culture, such as to encourage more open research. And I think this is also really important on the national level. When a national kind of public funding body recognizes this through the funding incentives that they have, it really directs, people to do the work that I think is needed to create that research culture and institutions to enable open source and open research work. So I think it really comes from both ways. And I think this is a conversation that needs to happen between universities and higher level policymakers to see how we can create those incentive structures, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you. And I would like to just build on that as well, just to comment about the fact that I think, as you say, first of all, people follow the money. So like, so if there are changes in funding policies, that is a clear incentive for folks to change their behavior in order to access that funding. And that's absolutely the case. And it's no doubt that higher level policy changes do influence or send signals as to where things are going and the motivation, and help give clarity around why we might be moving in a particular area. I'll just add a note of caution to say that certainly in the public sector space, and when we think about governmental policies around open source, that there was a lot of attention maybe 10 years ago given to the idea of, oh, we just need government policies. If we have a government policy, all will be okay. And some countries did bring in government policies to suggest that they would have more open source, but it didn't necessarily solve the problem. And so I would just put a note of caution to say that, yes, it would be wonderful to have more high level policy direction and funding and everything, but there's still a job of work to be done to make sure that if that policy exists, that it's a frictionless path to enabling that within the university sector. So back to your point, Pen, there's lots that universities can do, and there's lots that needs to be done to actually make sure that even if there's a policy change and everyone says, yes, from here forth, everything should be open source, to get that embedded in the system of university and the individual behavior of researchers so they understand what that means. That would be a huge job of work regardless. So I just, it's no easy answer, I guess, but just to point that out. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and sorry, it's just to build on a question or build on a point that Penn had said, and I'm more curious than anything else, is you talked about the constraints that exist, and I think it's fascinating to understand what those constraints are on the basis that open source came out of the university. Right? So the foundation of open source has come out of the university model. It's gone out and effectively brought this, wonderfulness to the world. So, as it evolves now, and again, at a rapid pace of adoption right now, I suppose the university's role there is again becoming even more important. And I suppose, what constraints do you see in order for those adoption practices to come into play, or that it can become again more widespread, accepted, or is it not?
So just to repeat the question for those online, the question is around what are the constraints that are actually blocking this within the context of universities? So we'll get some examples then.
So an open source example comes to mind, actually, and without naming too many names, obviously 3D printing is a big thing now. It's really well established, actually, and it's built on top of a lot of previous technologies, right? And there's this researcher who developed, an engineer who developed one of the key technologies underlying 3D printing today. He worked at a university and he did all of the development there. But he published his work, he created a community around it that's open source and all that. It's so great. But within the university, when people in management learned of it, they're like, oh wait, you didn't like patent this, you didn't commercialize this, there's no spin-out company from this. Your thing is obviously, not of value or something that we care about. And he was sort of discouraged by that. And he left the university because of that. And to tie it into the conversation I had that I was talking about before, what happens is that even within a university, some of the constraints are simply because a lot of the open research and open source work is not recognized and not incentivized, such as in internal assessment structures or promotion assessments. Because academic researchers are so, short on time. And if they're not going to be recognized or assessed for doing X, and they are only assessed for doing Y, they only have so little time, so they have to do Y instead. So, for example, being able to realize that hey, there's actually more we can do even within a university. One thing that I know is happening at the University of Bristol right now is that I was part of a small part of a effort last year to review and revise its internal assessment framework for academics, and now there is a lot more recognition of open research and open science and open source work by academics in the promotion structure within the university. And this is something the university can just decide to do, even without having to change the wider higher education sector and all of the other external institutions to make happen, if that makes sense. So I hope this is an example of how universities can make some changes internally to change the incentive and recognition structure to recognize the role that people play in open source and open research.
Thank you very much, Pen. And I'm going to have a comment from the floor.
Yeah, so another comment. There are some schools that were famous for their openness for decades that recently changed that stance in favor of doubling down on patents. And taking on patent reform is such a big problem that nobody really has time or energy to deal with it. And yet it's got to happen because those structures don't actually map very well to the life of software, the value of software, lots of things it doesn't have about to. But every time we have a single example like a CRISPR, right, that where two major universities end up duking it out and one of them wins and one of them loses, who really loses in that are people that are trying to work transparently without pandering to patents. I think that because all of the universities that signed on to the patent thing are like A-list, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, that feels overwhelming to smaller universities that aren't as well funded, but actually the smaller universities have a much bigger role to play than they think they do. There's nothing that says that those people made the right choice when they totaled down. And at least two of them, fought it out, and one of them sad that they didn't win now. What would be great is if smaller universities, like everything in Ireland, would decide that they could go another way and go ahead and build that value and let those people learn their lesson on their own. I think that would be really valuable. But one of the things that means is that people that support researchers who are doing open source have to have access to legal support. And if it's too big an ask for individual universities to provide that support, then SFI or somebody like it should be creating a board of people that all the universities could use for that purpose. Because I get calls, and I am not a lawyer. I did run the open source initiative for a long time, so I know a lot more about licensing than most people. But there's no way that I can go up against MIT and say, you guys screwed this up. But a consortium of universities could.
So that's probably a long comment to summarize, so I hope some people online heard that. But what I will say is that it was a call about the idea that just because some big name universities might go in a way that suggests that they're moving in a less open way, it actually provides an opportunity for less big organizations or universities to actually show the way show value and actually compete in that academic landscape based on an alternative approach, which of course is exactly what's happened in the commercial world. So yeah, absolutely, that will follow a pattern that's worked in elsewhere. Aoife.
Can I just add to that? I think one of the challenges is that the means by which value from open is captured is really challenging still. Patents are a really easy metric. Like you can count them, you can count the number of publications, you can do all that, but actually capturing different forms of value that come from open is a lot more challenging, and often it can be a narrative or a qualitative rather than a quantitative metric, and just inherently they take longer to describe and all of that kind of stuff. So I do think that, and I know there is a piece of work being done on it in certain areas, but it is a piece of work that needs to be done, and until you can demonstrate to the powers that be, whoever they may be, are they funders, is it the university itself, whoever it is, until you can like show and demonstrate that value really clearly in a way that they understand, it's always going to be a challenge fighting against, well, we have however many 100 patents here. So you need some sort of comparator, and I think that is still a gap.
Okay, thank you. And again, to summarize, that's a call for some way of demonstrating the value of open collaboration when put up against how easy it is to just count patents. So really this is about how do we tell that that narrative, how do we prove value, how do we compare levels of value and things like that in terms of being able to do that easily, to describe it to the powers that be.
Just one, okay, sorry, first.
And I think, I always harp on about this, the definition of value, right? So when we define what value is, well, then we can match what it turns out to be. And what I'm hearing is that, commercialization is a significant value point, but again, how do we capture all the other value points and how they align to university goals? And I think that's important. And how do we look at, again, funders who are taxpayers, our value as well into this whole world as well, and how does that get included?
Okay, so the question is about how. So just before we go back to I do want to come to some of the panelists here. Ian, do you have a comment to make about capturing the value, and then we'll come to Denise as well. But just to follow up on that point.
Denise was after.
Yeah, then you go ahead, go first.
Because we'll hear you.
Also, I'm going to talk too long, so.
I think there's a hierarchy of problems here. You could start it off with regard to the external ones and how we manage all that. But I think from Penn's, Daniels, and Tobias's talks, there's a set of capabilities you can just get on with, and that just improves operational efficiency and code reuse efficiency. If you want to do the inner source versus outer source model, that's fair enough. So I think there are challenges and means to address those challenges that are entirely within our organization. And that can start with just the basics, software engineering basics at the ground level, working up through some organizational constructs that resolve this conflict between motivational factors and drivers. And then there'll be external, funder-driven valuation metrics. Patents is an easy valuation metric. I'm not saying it's a good one, it's an easy one. So there's certain valuation metrics that are just easy to point to. They're not easy to achieve, but they're just commonly used. And the whole impact narrative, the impact story, that is going to have to evolve and develop over time. But I think just not to lose sight of the fact that there is a hierarchy of problems. So what problem do we wish to solve today? And I think there is value and merit in just delineating that which we can and should do now, which is achievable by the talent within schools, that which is achievable and doable across the institution with regard to reward mechanisms, and that which needs to be addressed at a higher level, meta level perhaps, in funder. So just not to lose sight of the fact that it's not one problem, it's a hierarchy of problems here.
It's a great point. Perhaps we need to do more work to delineate those so we can all feel like there's something we can all go after immediately. Daniel?
But to add to this point, what I would say is that thanks to open source, or open source is kind of lowering the barrier. All of these hierarchical problems, that is helping to move forward probably faster and fail faster.
Yes, it's the mechanism by which you get there quicker.
Yeah.
Because rather than saying, let's duke it out over who's got the better algorithm to do X, we just work in the open source domain and work through the open source as a way of enabling all of us to come to an agreed position and an agreed way of working and an agreed repo, and all the things we have to do to be good citizens in this space.
And do you want to go back?
Yeah, I do. Every time we get into this particular part of the conversation, I wonder how widely known the Santa Cruz story is. Had you guys just, I know Daniel knows, the University of California, Santa Cruz has an institute that is a profit center for the university, and it's all based on open source. And it's very well documented exactly what they did, exactly how they did it. One of the components is you need local tech or local deep pocket, but ideally tech, to create the feedback loop that makes that work. But I think probably you guys don't know about it at all. Is that true? Yeah, see, I think we have to amplify the people who have figured it out
Yeah.
and threaded the needle.
Yeah.
And then everybody can try to see if it works for them. I mean, there are unique things about Santa Cruz that might not make it work everywhere, but.
So just as, again, just for folks that may not have heard that, and this is a point that not only should we be delineating between these various different challenges, but also there are some patterns that exist out there today where people have actually demonstrated real value and measurable value in the context of open. And the example that was used was UC Santa Cruz, University of California, Santa Cruz, who have a research center that has become a profit center, all based on open source and based on the principles of open. And how they managed to do that, thanks to a successful graduate who went out and based his whole career on open source, made his money on the back of that, came back and wanted to get the university to enable other people to do the same thing. That proved to be a really great model for the university in terms of actually building this research center based on that technology, but also for all the surrounding ecosystem companies that feed from a talent perspective of that university. So it was a wonderful symbiotic system, all based on open source, that did provide real measurable value. So a good point is we should be capturing these examples as we go of where value does exist, so that perhaps we can start sharing different patterns that might work in that respect. So where would we capture said story is a good point, because is there a place where this meta discussion is happening where we are all contributing these kinds of stories? Actually, I'll ask you, Pen, where should we share that story to actually make that more impactful?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking, this sounds like an amazing meta research project, right? To do a review and explore and see what good examples are out there. It's almost like, the equivalent of doing a very formal literature review.
Yeah.
Rather than finding papers, you go out and look for these stories. And this itself can be an academic research project. And once you've done that, another recent conversation I had was about there's this gap between academic research that happens and the people who makes the decisions. Or the people who makes decisions are not usually the people who will go out and read these academic papers in journals. So how do you bridge this gap is another thing. And one of the leads in our research group right now, he's the pro-vice chancellor of research culture at our university. And I was having a conversation with him, and he was talking about how it would be good to have a repository of meta research on, improving research policy and culture that becomes well known enough that policymakers can just refer to. Now, I don't know if such a thing exists yet, but it does remind me of some of the work that the people behind the UNESCO recommendation on open science are doing, because they do go through this process of trying to gather experiences and stories from around the world, in this case, to put into some of their policy guidance. So UNESCO might be a place, I don't know, but yeah, I think there's a place for research evidence on this to be gathered and be visible to policymakers.
And thank you, and I guess that's an action we can take from this discussion. We have
Yeah, I have a question about like the role of competition. Like universities have a lot of competition among themselves. So I think that they have rankings and all those things. So all these things have an impact on collaboration. So a lot of people like try to compete. So then I think it becomes like very difficult for people to collaborate in terms of, the university want to get a good ranking. So I think it has an external role, in terms of playing the universities. Like, how do you think you can address that?
Okay, so a very specific question that I repeat about the idea of competition culture between universities in terms of them wanting to get a higher ranking or whatever. And how does that act as a constraint and how do you address that in helping, in trying to get universities to collaborate? And you want to address that?
That happens in industry. I mean, you have in any open source foundation competitors that are producing the basics of the technology. And then at the end, at the top of the pyramid, they are producing the added business value for their customers. This is working for IBM, for Meta, for Google, for, so why not for universities? Basically, you can build together all across the universities internally or with other partners, industrial partners as well, the basics of infrastructure that you need from a research perspective. And then go to the top level, and then your research specifically will be very specific for your needs. But the basics you need, open source.
Yeah, I'm actually looking about some research, like people are like Harvard or the top universities are actually doing some fake science, they're actually published papers which were actually flawed. So they actually found all these things, because, they have these incentives, publish papers. So that's why they need to find something interesting. So even though it was not interesting, they had to fake it. And then they found it was actually not true. So because people are all building this fake science, instead of because monetization things. So I guess I'm just wondering about the collaboration rules, in terms of in case we try to make this less competitive, maybe people will be faithful, slowly.
Yeah, well, indeed, the open source, the transparency would possibly
Yeah.
make that one. I suppose I just want to add in, and there's an element to those industry collaborations and this idea of people collaborating on some of the common challenges across. There's a kind of an element as well about the relationships that are formed in doing that mean that there's a added value now, maybe not something that can be measured easily. But if you're in with the cool kids doing the cool research on the common elements versus out on your own trying to replicate it all by yourself, there is a culture where you can start ranking your ability to be in that club as being something that sets you apart from some universities who are sitting in their little island, as demonstrated with Daniel's diagrams, where they're only talking to each other because, God knows the individuals within universities are always looking for those opportunities. They're not necessarily tied to one university for their entire career either. So the individuals involved may have different motivations than perhaps even the institutions to have those collaborations happen.
And before all the hands that were raised, just to finish here, I would add that collaboration is already happening in research because workshops are for that. Places where we go, we try to publish, and then we have discussions and conversations. So this is useful, this is not, and then there is a research process. Like, okay, then I go to a conference, maybe I finish in a journal. So there is a whole collaboration process. Specifically, workshops in academia are for this. Yeah, you are competing with others, but it's for collaboration.
So another point.
Let's question more of a comment, but I think it's interesting because it could be another constraint that we see. Interesting enough, the University of Utrecht, who's like in the top 50 in Europe in terms of contributions, has now decided to pull the plug. It's not going to play the ranking scale. So
as well too.
Okay, so we've got.
Are there constraints in relation to this, and is it preventing them doing good citizenship? Be interesting.
Well, so the comment is, and just to reiterate here, so what we're seeing is that some universities are deciding to break the mold, try a new pathway, stop thinking about how they've been ranked based on criteria in the past, and move forward in what they consider to be the best pathway forward. So maybe there's a revolutionary moment at hand in terms of actually, one would argue that the whole open research, open science movement itself is a change and a shift in behaviour that is moving us more towards that collaborative aspect. So very quickly now, because we're running out of time.
Yes, so good news on the patent pool problem in the States. There are two major universities and they're two of the best funded research institutions that refused to sign on to the patent thing. One was Johns Hopkins and the other one was CMU. And I think it's going to be very interesting over the next 10 years how much ground they gain for making that decision. I think we have to all support them in that. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is a call out. The way that we made open source survive was a combination of strategic humility. We were weirdos and we stayed under the radar long enough until there was enough value creation that we could come out. So that was a strategy. But then the other one was when we saw misbehavior, we called it out. And there's probably an unwritten rule in academia that you don't do that, but that is fair in open source. I'm just saying.
So there's more. So again, to summarize, we won't go into the detail, but one thing would be to amplify the organizations and the universities who are either bucking the trend or deciding to go in that more collaborative way. So alongside capturing the stories, we probably need to think as a community about celebrating the stories and amplifying the stories where things are done in what we see to be the right way, but also to have a considered, while humble, opinion about why people are doing it the wrong way, and to be open about that and call it. I think hopefully it summarizes those points. And Kevin, you wanted to make
Yeah, I think one problem is perhaps wrong metrics in academia, right? So some metrics of success relate to journal impact factor or university rankings and stuff like that, which counter the idea of, say, the DORA agreement or the open source movement. And yeah, so there's that comment. And then the idea that, say, it is easy to show the success or the metrics for patents. I'm just wondering, is that because there's a monetary value you can attach to that? And it was great to hear about that Santa Cruz example where there is value being created in terms of money again, isn't it? But there's other metrics of success and impacts in open source. And I think you mentioned 4 projects or spun out of one open source project, wasn't it? Like you release some open source software and then 4 new initiatives started. Like that's impact. Maybe you don't measure it in euros, maybe you can, maybe you can't. But isn't it also easy on GitHub? You can see this project was forked 200 times, inspired these other 20 projects. Actually, all of the data is on GitHub, isn't it? Can't we turn that into useful metrics? Or what are successful or easy metrics that we could be creating for open source? Maybe people could comment on that.
So I will, just noting the fact that we're coming up on time, I will just try to repeat, no, because I think they're great points. So just to reiterate the points that you made there, one is that we should actually identify and examine the conflicts that are there right now in terms of perhaps conflicting goals when you have these incentives that are being driven into the system through rankings and things like that, and agreements and policies that universities have already signed up to, like the DORA agreement, which would be leading people to go more open. But there's conflicts inherent in having both of those, caring about both of those things that we should acknowledge and name. But that the second point is that even aside from the monetary value, which may be easy to measure from a patent perspective or whatever, there is that idea that there are other metrics out there already today where people measure the impact of open source and how do we maybe raise the awareness of that. And I just want to make a call out to the fact that the chaos working group that Daniel referred to and is part of as well, the Community Health Analytics for Open Source Software group has a university working group exactly examining that, and they meet every second Wednesday. So if folks are interested in that, I would definitely recommend checking that discussion out. But Tobias, did you want to bring us to a close now, because we're probably at the last few minutes?
I would maybe add something to that topic as well. Is one thing we saw as well is there's a huge difference of perception between creating own project versus contributing even actively to an existing one, even if they would be the same effort. The one gives you a lot of more blood in the community than the other one. And I think that's something we, both in research as well as for developers in general, we should encourage that working together gets some extra incentives versus creating something new just for the sake of having something on your own, because it's at the end of the day doesn't bring us as a whole forward.
It's a great point.
So I think that's a challenge. I don't have a solution for that, but I wanted to raise that as well.
No, it's fantastic. And it's an acknowledgement that not even the open source community, I think, has this cracked in terms of what we really, what we should be measuring and celebrating to that degree. So to your point, contributions into existing projects are probably worth twice as much as a proliferation of open source projects, which will probably introduce competition issues that probably no one needs either. So yeah, it's a great point. Thank you, Tobias. Well, I'm unfortunately we're at time, so I'm going to wrap up this panel session. I want to say a huge thank you to everyone who came along today, to our fabulous speakers. Thank you, Penn, Tobias, Daniel. Thank you, Ian, for joining us on the panel. Thank you to the University of Galway for hosting us today, and for Lero, who helped make this event possible. We really, really appreciate your support. And thanks to everyone who joined us today in the room here and online, and to everyone who may be watching this in the future. We think that this is a really valuable conversation. We hope to continue it both in the context of Open Ireland Network here locally, but also in the university ecosystem. There seems to be lots of going on, so we're looking forward to engaging with those conversations as we move forward. And without further ado, I want to say Have a great rest of day. And if anyone wants to find out more, we'll be sending around a follow-up email with links to some of our presentations so folks can access those to everyone registered online, and we'll send some details about how we can continue this conversation. So, and again, thank you, Michael, for all the work done to organise this event, and to everyone involved out there. So thanks everyone, and see you next time.